Moving on to another topic, the tagline of tonight, Law, Medicine, and the Right to Decide, had a subcategory associated with it saying ethical dilemmas from cradle to grave. Now, we don't have a lot of time to get into cradle matters. We're not going to get into abortion and all of the complexities that go along with that tonight. We'll save that for another time. Suffice it to say that the traditional Jewish view is that a fetus is not considered viable until it graduates from medical school. I was hoping that would go over well. You could say law school if it's better. But Rabbi Broid sits on a reproductive ethics panel, and in our conference call, he brought up a very interesting scenario regarding the right to decide and parents choosing embryos that many of us would say they're clearly making the wrong decision. What happens when people who have a right to decide make a decision that we individuals, we of a particular faith, we as society have serious problems with? Rabbi Broid, please.
I sit on a reproductive ethics panel, and we do PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And parents come in and they give us a number of embryos. We take a number of embryos, really, and we tell them things about their embryos. It started, of course, as a way of eliminating illness. But as it has evolved, parents make all sorts of choices, gender choices, very fascinating choices. A few years ago, a couple came in with congenital genetic deafness, and they wanted to do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to make sure that their child was deaf. Because...
Hold on. Say that again.
To make sure that their child was deaf. Because mommy is deaf and daddy is deaf, and they were afraid of raising a child who could hear. Because, think about it, how would you raise a child who could fly? I'd have a very hard time raising a child who could fly because they'd go through so many experiences that I couldn't imagine. My children already tell me I can hardly parent them because I'm so old. I don't understand the technology they deal with. Imagine if, as I was chasing after them, they could fly away. I wouldn't know what to do. So these parents said, we can't imagine raising a child who could hear. So we'd like to make sure through pre-implantation genetic diagnosis that we have a deaf child. That way, this will be a child whose perception of the world we understand. I wasn't the only person on the ethics panel who said, gee, I don't think we want to do this. I think that even though in general parents have lots of rights to decide among variables that children have, the parent's ability to assign their child to what we consider a disability made many of us very uncomfortable. I think that the Jewish tradition recognizes parents as having the right to make reasonable choices for their children. And you have a variety of choices you can make for your children. I guess they fit into two categories. There are those choices that your children can undo when they grow older, and parents have a great deal of flexibility. You want to give your 2-year-old a mohawk? It doesn't strike me as exactly right, but it's no problem because when he turns 18, he can keep the mohawk or not. But when it comes to irrevocable choices, parents are called upon to make choices diligently in the best interests of their children. And as I said to the committee at the time, think about these parents pre-PGD. If they had had a hearing child and they brought him in and requested surgery to make him deaf, would we have permitted that? Everybody said, of course not. We would never permit surgery to make a child deaf. So how is this different? But there are limits to the right to decide that parents might have.
Doctor.
Yes, well, I think the field of assisted reproductive technology has brought and is bringing and will continue to bring true moral dilemmas. First of all, I should say that there are no laws really which govern this.
That was my part.
That's your part.
Are there any laws?
I will leave that.
No?
It's called the Wild West of medicine, that people can basically do what they want, pretty much. And so along the lines, we have a very responsible head of assisted reproductive technology at Columbia, Dr. Mark Sauer, who unfortunately is leaving. But he wrote an editorial in one of the journals of ART stating that he felt it was unethical for gender selection in pre-implantation a genetic diagnosis. In other words, if a person wishes to have in vitro fertilization for the purpose of not having the woman give birth to a child with a serious disease, well, while you're at it, we do want a boy or we do want a girl, so let's choose only the male or the female embryos to implant in the mother that don't have the disease. And he felt that that was unethical. There are other doctors who will say, get over it. What's the problem? Patients have that autonomous right. Why deprive them of it? So this is just another area where it can go kind of either way. I'll give you, there are those that feel that parents have complete autonomy in this area and that doctors are pretty much just technicians to carry out the wishes of the parents to have a child. How about this one? How about a trans man, somebody born genetically a woman who is elected to become a male in all morphologic features, but retains his uterus and his fallopian tubes and wishes to bear a child and comes to the doctor for assistance in assisted reproductive technology? Should that person be given that right? Should that person be allowed to become pregnant and basically have a person who looks entirely like a man become pregnant and give birth to a child? As the rabbi said, we're not dealing just with the autonomous rights of parents here. We're also dealing with a child. And what are the likely effects of a child to be if he or she is born to somebody who looks like a man? We don't know the answer to that. But I can tell you that these are the sorts of issues that come up, and there are those that side very strongly on the side of the absolute right of parents' autonomy, and you're just there to be the technician. And there are those that say, no, 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 you have a responsibility also to the child who's going to be born, and if you think that this is inappropriate or will harm the child, you can refuse and should refuse to do so.
Professor, as you mentioned earlier, you're no longer practicing law, now you teach. So in areas of law like this, where there really is no law, where it is somewhat of the Wild West, from an academic perspective, from a legal perspective, is there a right and wrong when there is no actual law at hand? What do you teach your students?
Right, then you have to resort to the ethics, and I have to say that in some of the examples we've discussed, there is another side to the story. So I have heard the argument that people want a deaf child because they feel that the deaf community is a wonderful community, is close-knit, is enriching to its members, and they want their child to be part of it, not to be an outsider to that. And they think sign language is a beautiful language, and they want their child to communicate using sign language. And the same can be said for other disabilities as well. And so it's not so black and white, and when you teach law and you teach areas where there aren't any laws, you really push the students to think about the ethical aspects of the arguments.
So if a student came to you and said, I'm thinking of making that choice in my own personal life, I'm just curious, if you don't mind sharing, what would you tell them? Do you have a approach you take?
I would tell them to think very carefully about it, perhaps to get some counseling to make sure that they're thinking it through and making a responsible decision, to talk to other parents of children with that disability, but I would not be directive. I would not tell them that's wrong or that's wonderful either way.
See, when I was in rabbinical school, we had a gentleman who came to talk to us. We were studying for rabbinic ordination. He said, rabbis, it doesn't matter if you know what you're talking about or not. You have to answer with confidence. Just answer with confidence and everything will be okay. That is advice I never took, but we do want people to make the right decisions. I want to pose a question, and then we're going to go to another video clip. Along the lines of making difficult decisions, there's a story, it was in San Francisco, I believe it was 1989, Renata Daniel Patterson. It's a name that's not familiar to many people in the room. A young girl in San Francisco, early 1990s, is born with one kidney, degenerative kidney disease. She has a father who abandoned her at birth, was serving a 13-year life sentence in San Francisco prison. She needed a kidney. He reaches out, he finds out about the story, never met his daughter before, and offers a kidney to his daughter. They do the surgery, the transplant is successful. Jewish law, when it comes to organ transplants, we didn't have time to get into it tonight, is definitely in favor of saving lives whenever we can. They do the transplant, it's successful. He's still in prison, everything's fine. 5 years later, the kidney fails. They get a phone call from Daniel, who's sitting in prison. He says, "Give her my other kidney." Who wouldn't say that as a parent? Who wouldn't say that? Give her my other kidney. Do we believe in the right to decide? Does the father who's sitting in prison, prison is the side point here, does a father or parent have a right to say, give my child my last remaining kidney? I'll go on dialysis, I'll take my chances. Doctor.
I would say absolutely not. I would not do that. First of all, I don't see how this would be different from homicide. I can ask Professor
Well, it's
Hoffman.
different than homicide in the sense that he can go on dialysis.
It's, well, that's true.
And he
That's
can always
true.
he can always have a kidney
That's true.
transplant down the road. He has
That-
more time to find something.
That is true. I should take that back. You're absolutely right. I was thinking of a more vital organ. You're right. But I think in a situation like that, there have to be limits on the extent to which even a parent is willing to cause illness to themselves because of their willingness to help a loved one. I think that patients don't have the absolute right to say, I want this done. What if it was a situation where a patient had needed a liver transplant, and we've had circumstances like this, and the patient had liver cancer, and the likelihood of a liver transplant saving this person was maybe 5%. And the wife or the husband said, I don't care, I want to save my husband, and this is a very substantial operation. Does the husband or wife have the right to demand that half of their liver be given to their spouse for the likelihood of saving them 5%? I think that doctors have an objective responsibility. First, do no harm. Primum non nocere is a principle that goes back to ancient times, and we have to look at the patient that we're operating on. And if the likelihood of doing harm to this patient far outweighs any benefit from that, I think physicians have the ethical right and responsibility not to go down that path.
Professor, personal autonomy. He's saying it's my life, it's my body, it's no one else's business. I want to give that kidney to my daughter, and I'll take my chances. What's the law?
It's not going to work under the law because doctors have a responsibility to treat the patient, first of all, and if their treatment is doing more harm than good to the patient they're operating on, they're not permitted to do that. So I think that doctor who took out the second kidney would have problems with the licensing boards, would have problems with the law, because you can live without one kidney. You're going to have a lot of problems living with no kidneys.
Just out of curiosity, anyone feel that the father should be able to donate the second kidney? You could raise your hand. We're not counting.
Is he on death row?
No. No.
Okay.
First of all, he's in San Francisco, so you wouldn't do. There are no executions going on over there.
I think it's important to point out, too, that dialysis, it's not as if you take this pill and live till 75. This man's life expectancy will be considerably shortened as a result of being on dialysis. So that's important to point out.
So medicine being what it is and law being what it is, Rabbi, you looked at the room. There were more than 30 hands that went up. What would Jewish law say in this scenario?
I think it's important to spin out the parts here because I think many of us fall for a dodge here. We think to ourselves, oh, he's a prisoner. Since he's a prisoner, we should encourage this form of sacrifice. I think the Jewish tradition categorically rejects that. Prisoners have no more or less rights, and that there's no difference in this hypothetical between a prisoner and anybody else, maybe with the possible exception, as you hinted, of a prisoner on death row. So I think that whether this person is a prisoner or a United States senator hardly matters. I don't think a person has the right
It mattered for Mickey Mantle.
It did matter for Mickey Mantle, it's true. I think that it's important to understand that a person doesn't have the right to give of himself in a way that profoundly harms himself, causes his own death or significant diminution of his lifespan for the benefit of another human being. Much of the nitty-gritty details here would depend on the effectiveness of dialysis. I think a person could give a kidney away if dialysis were completely effective and being on dialysis was just a pain, meaning you had to go to a dialysis center regularly, but it didn't profoundly curtail your lifestyle. That's not the reality at this very moment technologically. A person does not have the right to sacrifice their life for the benefit of, for sure, one single other person, putting aside rare situations like wartime or other highly unusual, irregular situations. So I think that this prisoner is not allowed to donate his second kidney, is encouraged to donate his first kidney, and more than that, I don't think.
If anyone knows the end of the story, she ended up getting a partial match kidney, Renata, from an uncle of hers. It lasted for a few years, and then she died at the age of 25, at which time the people that were proponents for the father giving the kidney said, you see, if he would have given the kidney, she would be alive today. And the people that said she shouldn't have gotten that kidney said, you see, she got a kidney from the uncle. There were other options available, and the debate does continue. We are going to move on to the discussion of the right to decide when it comes to a little bit of cradle. We're going to get into the right to decide when it comes to end of life and grave matters. If we can roll the video clip from another great legal sage, Seinfeld.
Did you take this out of the garbage?
Yeah, it's still got some spring in the strings.
Jerry, this is a piece of junk. How are you going to be the executor of my living will? You see, you can't let go.
Trust me, Kramer, given the legal opportunity, I will kill you.
I wish I could believe you. Hey, Elaine, do you have some free time tomorrow afternoon?
Me?
Yeah, because you're perfect. You're a calculating, cold-hearted businesswoman. And when there's dirty work to be done, you don't mind stomping on a few throats.
Oh, come on. Doctor, how's her coma?
Oh, exactly the same. Wait a minute. She's coming out of the coma. Mrs. Albright, can you hear me? Are you okay?
I feel so rested and refreshed. Get me a toothbrush.
Oh, Jerry, listen. I saw the rest of that movie, The Other Side of Darkness. The coma lady wakes up at the end.
Oh, I wanted to see that. Thanks. Thanks a lot.
I didn't know it was possible to come out of a coma.
I didn't know it was possible not to know that.
How was Eric Roberts as the husband?
Oh, unforgettable. All right, I gotta find Elaine. She's gonna pull my plug. Shellback! Hey.
How's he doing?
He's been sleeping a lot. He's still groggy.
Well, I thought a movie might cheer him up. Outlet. Ah.
It's always good to start a topic like that on a little bit of a lighter note. But truth be told, it's a very serious topic when you talk about end of life, and it's a topic that well, just pause for a moment and be sensitive of the fact that many of us in the room are dealing with this issue as we speak. My grandmother is in very serious condition in a Long Island hospital, and I know that many of us on the panel have dealt with this matter on a personal level, and these decisions of what to do are very difficult. I remember sitting with Barry several years ago, and as a rabbi, I see this, and I said, many people across the street are in difficult circumstances, and the families are getting together, and they want to make the right decision. They want to make the right decision. They just don't know what the right decision is. It's not always so clear-cut as to what the right decision is. So for our third and final segment this evening, I'd like to get into a little bit of the discussion around right to die, assisted suicide, end of life. And Dr. Prager, tell us about an 85-year-old woman that walked into your office several years ago.
Yes, this was a true ethical conundrum. A couple of years ago, a patient that I had been caring for as her general internist for about 30 years came into my office accompanied by her daughter and her son. She had a pacemaker which was put in several months before, and she said, "Dr. Prager, I want you to turn off my pacemaker. I learned just a few weeks ago that I have early Alzheimer's and I don't want to go that route. You know that I cared for my husband, he was also my patient, who died of Alzheimer's." And she said, "This is not for me. I have the right to refuse life-sustaining treatment, and I want this pacemaker removed. I've already begun to lose my memory somewhat. I'm finding it difficult to live alone at home." To my surprise, her daughter and her son backed her completely and were actually quite upset with me when I hemmed and hawed about doing this. I had never been faced with a situation like this where somebody who looked quite well, who was awake, alert, not imminently dying, said, "I have the right to refuse life-sustaining treatment and you have the obligation to stop this life-sustaining treatment because I said so." And I decided, I said, "Well, I'd like you to first see one of our palliative care doctors. I'd like you to see a psychiatrist, make sure she's not depressed. And we have to discuss this at the ethics committee," and so on and so forth. I won't tell you actually what subsequently happened because I'd like my co-panelists to weigh in on this a little bit. But on the one hand, the woman was right, and her son, who happened to be a lawyer, by the way, who flew in from another city to make sure that I carried out the wishes, he even cited to me an article that appeared in one of the respected medical journals that was a consensus statement by a number of societies which said that patients have the right, if they have capacity, to remove electrical life-sustaining devices such as pacemakers, ventricular assist devices, and it was no different from removing, say, a ventilator and so forth. And so, on the other hand, the vast majority of times that we remove life-sustaining treatment from patients are in patients who are imminently dying, who are suffering, usually in the hospital, very often in the intensive care unit. Very often they are not awake and alert. And the decision to remove life support is really a humane one, where we feel we are perpetuating and prolonging the dying process and not removing and not shortening someone's life. This lady could live for a few more years, perhaps even longer. Obviously, Alzheimer's is a horrible disease, and one could empathize and sympathize with her desire not to go down that path. So this was a unique circumstance. I can tell you that I personally, as a physician, could not bring myself to have this patient come in the hospital, sedate her, and turn off her pacemaker. That's me. That's my gut. I could not do that. On the other hand, there are doctors who would be willing to do that. What you would have to do, of course, is make sure that she doesn't have a treatable depression, that there are no coercive factors over here. But we are going to face these circumstances more and more often. We have at Columbia a ventricular assist device program, which is sort of an artificial heart that patients can have, which can prolong their lives with end-stage heart failure. And currently, right now, we have a circumstance where a man who is not imminently dying, but who had a stroke following his ventricular assist device placement, has really incapacitated him greatly, has difficulty walking, has difficulty with his sight, and he's decided he doesn't want to go on like this. In this case, his son and his wife don't want him to die, but he's very adamant that this is what he wants. I'm telling you this because we're going to see this more and more, and this does present certain ethical conundrums, at least for me.
So, Professor, this 85-year-old woman with a son who's an attorney, before she had her 12 o'clock appointment with Dr. Prager, had a 9 o'clock appointment with her attorney, and just to finalize matters of her estate. And she tells the attorney, "I plan on going to my doctor and saying, turn off my pacemaker." What's the legal perspective here?
Yeah, Dr. Prager is correct. People have an absolute right to refuse medical care or to ask that medical care be withdrawn. So if you have a feeding tube and you don't want it anymore, you can ask to have it removed. This is a more sensitive situation because the patient is basically well. I suspect that if they went to court and they asked a judge to force a doctor or a hospital to remove or to stop the pacemaker, I'm not sure how that would come out. I clerked for a judge, and judges don't like to have deaths on their conscience. So a judge might try to say this patient is depressed. The complication here is that the decision makers, the children, are supportive and say, fine, if she can't make this decision, we're saying stop the treatment, stop the pacemaker. So this is a tricky case, but I think she has a legal right to make that demand. I have to say I have some sympathy for her. This would be an easy, relatively painless way to avoid perhaps years and years of dementia. And I know in my case, my mother predeceased my father after my father's found himself a widower after 54 years of marriage. He developed dementia. He really was very, very depressed and not enjoying life. And about 6 months before he died, we were faced with the decision of, do we replace the pacemaker battery? It was going to run out, and we toyed with the idea that if he were able to tell us, maybe he would say, I don't want the pacemaker battery to be replaced. He hadn't said that. We decided to replace it. He lived for another 6 months, which were pretty miserable, so we were not sure that that was a kindness. But this issue does come up in a whole lot of families.
So Rabbi Broid, before you give us the Jewish law perspective on this, as a former clerk of Judge Garth of blessed memory, having read many of his opinions, as we're all now aware, what would he have done had a case like this come into his courtroom? We're a judge of his caliber. Judges don't want deaths on their conscience, but how would a judge deal with this type of matter, or the heart-wrenching matters that come in front of judges when two parents are fighting each other about removing life support or things like that? How do judges deal with that?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between, do I want to give the patient the right to find a physician who wants to do this procedure, and forcing a physician to engage in a procedure that the physician themselves is morally opposed to? I highly doubt that you would find a judge, and I don't think Judge Garth would have ever ordered a physician to engage in a medical procedure that the physician was opposed to as a matter of principle. That's not the same as the question of, if the patient wants this and the physician is willing to do this, prohibiting this activity. I don't think that American law would rush to prohibit this activity if everybody wanted it, but I don't think American law would order a physician to provide a treatment that the physician themselves deemed to be an act of homicide. I think that the Jewish tradition here tries to say something very hard but important. Although ferocious pain is grounds for ending a person's life by refusing to treat, the classical example is the 16th century responsa of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who deals with a man who has gangrene of his leg. The year is about 1650. There's no anesthesia, but they knew how to treat gangrene of the leg. They sawed your leg off without anesthesia, and then they cauterized your leg with a hot metal plate. Just repeating that seems very painful. Rabbi Emden observes that a person can pass up that treatment because of the ferocious pain, although he doesn't encourage that passing. He says that's a choice you can make, but you can choose to live with the pain if you wish. But I think it's important to distinguish, and I think the Jewish tradition says this very much. The pain your family feels watching you demented is not the same pain that the patient themselves feels. Frequently, we see a great person not in their greatness. and it pains us. It's extremely important, the Jewish tradition says, not to infer from that they are in pain. You'd have to show great pain. I'll reflect for a moment on my own life if I can keep myself fully composed. My father is the primary moral figure in my life. My father is 80. He suffers from dementia, and he suffered from dementia for a few years. He's a rabbi with a PhD in physical chemistry in an era where PhDs in physical chemistry are hard to get. I think they're still pretty hard to get. He was always sort of a deeply intellectual figure in my life. I remarked to people that I never saw my father watching television except for when I was 5. He woke me up at like 3 in the morning to say, "Come watch television with me," which I thought was sort of amazing as a 5-year-old, because my father never watched television, and he was going to wake me up, and he took me downstairs to watch the lunar landing. And he remarked to me that this was something that I should never forget. And really, it's the only time I can recall my father watching television with me as a child, watching an adult program, sort of. My father watches a lot of television now. He watches a lot of television. I can't tell if he enjoys it or not. Every time I see him, it pains me a little bit, because I remember somebody very different. But it doesn't pain him. He doesn't remember somebody different. And instead, I invest all the time, and my mother phenomenally invests all the time in the most ferociously protective way in making sure that my father is happy, content, well treated. Is he the lion in his prime that he was when I was growing up? No. But it's important to recognize that that's a pain that he doesn't feel. That's a pain that I feel. That's a pain that my mother ferociously feels every day. It's important to recognize that there is a place in the Jewish tradition for stopping treatment when a person feels ferocious pain. But my practical experience has been that frequently patients don't feel this ferocious pain. Their family feels ferocious pain because they do a compare and contrast that the patient themselves is not making. The patient remembers only the present, and they don't compare themselves to what they were in their youth. The Jewish tradition reminds us very intensely that when parents say about their dying children, I used to do pediatric ethics, and parents would say, "I feel the pain of watching my child die. Can't the child die quicker so that my pain will end?" And I'd have to intervene to say, no, your child will not die faster so that you can feel less pain. The same thing is true. The pain children feel watching their parents age is not the kind of pain the Jewish tradition is talking about. There might very well be situations in which a person can cease treatment in the face of ferocious pain. I don't deny that criteria at all in any way, shape, or form. It could exist. But the pain that others feel watching you deteriorate, that's not the pain the Jewish tradition feels. It's so important to recognize this. Much of what goes on from assisted suicide onward is driven by those around us saying, you know, taking care of you is difficult. Wouldn't it be more convenient if we didn't have to visit you every week? How can we do that? Oh, we know how. Have you considered assisted suicide? It's so important to understand.
Could you imagine billboards? Have you considered assisted suicide?
I've suggested it occasionally in my mean-spirited moments to my law students. They don't like it at all. They remind me that that's why Socrates was murdered. That's something, a problem with the Socratic method. But it's important to understand that the Jewish tradition does not consider the pain felt by others in any circumstance as ample grounds for a person to stop treatment. So I worry in cases like this that the pain is not real, and it's instead induced by family members saying, we don't want to take care of you as you slip away.
So I know that Dr. Prager, I know that in doing my research, I know that your parents of blessed memory were together for 73 years, married for 69 of them, and the last couple years were difficult. I'm sure you see this a lot, and I see this too in my practice and my work. I see people say sometimes the equivalent of, I want to put them out of my misery. How do you deal with that? How do you respond to that? And is there a right and wrong when it comes to that question?
Now, let me, a few comments. Number one, I would differ a bit with Rabbi Broid about the situation here. I think there are people who feel very strongly about their sense of independence and who want to end it because they want to end it on their terms, not because of the pain that it might cause others. I'm not saying that that doesn't occur. But I think in this lady's case, in the case of the person with the ventricular assist device, there are people who feel very strong, I want to live on my terms and my terms only. And I think that many of the people who do undergo assisted suicide in Oregon, Washington, and other states, they want the comfort of knowing that they can end it when they want to on their terms. That's number one. Point number two, I just want to point out the difference between withholding and withdrawing. In the case of Professor Hoffman's father, I personally would not have had any difficulty, and if the family had requested, don't put the batteries back in, I would have had no trouble with that. A passive issue is much more acceptable to me than an active issue where I am the agent of that person's death as a result of a proactive action that I've taken. What happened with that case, I might just tell you, is that, and just fast forward, the Ethics Committee at Columbia, we decided that at that point in time it would be inappropriate and wrong to do it. The patient went to another hospital where her pacemaker was turned off and she died. And I think the point that was made that it would be unlikely for a judge to rule that I had to do it. They would respect my ethical qualms about doing such, but I had the obligation to try to find somebody who would do that. If there were no physician who were willing to do it, then there's probably something wrong with the request. As far as what Rabbi says about my parents, I should say my parents both died at home. My mother-in-law, who lived with me and my wife for 9 years with dementia, a terrible thing to watch her. It caused us a great deal of pain, and we know that it would have caused her to know what she was going through. So I think everybody would like to be able to die at home the way Jacob died, with his surrounded by his sons, to be compos mentis to the very end, and to be able to bless all of his children. And unfortunately, and maybe I'm changing the focus of the subject, I'll just have to put this in.
Okay, we got 5 minutes left and then we're done, so we can change anything
just
we
saying
want.
that unfortunately, we don't have enough opportunities to give people the opportunity to die under their terms at home. And we do need, as was mentioned before, we need better palliative care and better opportunities for people to be able to be in the bosom of their home with their family, to be able to die that way. And I think we're heading as a country in that direction.
So coming full circle over here. Actually, you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Yes, so
8:15 will be done, guaranteed. 8:15, mid-sentence, we will be finished 8:15.
So just a couple of quick points in
I
response.
appreciate everyone's patience. We're doing great.
First of all, it's not always true that patients can find another doctor. Patients are constrained by their health insurance policies. Patients are constrained by where they live. There may not be another hospital. They may not have access to other doctors. So sometimes it does come down to this healthcare facility or no others. And also, I worry a little bit about discounting the patient's own suffering. There are people who are pleasantly demented who really don't realize what's going on. There are a lot of patients with dementia who fully realize what's going on, who suffer every day, who are angry, whose personality changes. In my case, that's what happened to my father, and he was fully aware that things were not going the way he wanted them to go and that he was not the same person. And the same is true for actual physical pain, cancer patients, My husband has Parkinson's disease, and so I'm learning a lot about the Parkinson's community. And people really do suffer, and it's a little bit dangerous to say, oh, well, it's only the family that's suffering, the patient isn't suffering that badly. So I just want to bringing the patient's own perspective back here.
Thank you very much. Coming full circle over here, Barry Ostrowski earlier spoke about the role of society or society's obligation in not only caring for the people in need of health care, but funding that and how we should deal with those challenges presently and moving forward. I know someone mentioned to me the other day about the method they have, the Singaporean method, which is you're allotted X amount of dollars at birth, and when it's over, and your family can kick in and fund it if they'd like to, which gives some incentive for families to get along with each other because you may need them one day, unless you're working out. It encourages people to go to the gym and stay healthy too, so not to have to need their families. But final comment, give us 60 seconds, each of the panelists, on society's obligation. Our society is obviously different because we care for people in need. We allow people into emergency rooms who are in need of care, and we do believe in the greater cause of healing and caring for patients, clients, and everyone around us. Give us a minute on that. Professor.
So it's true we have a law that requires emergency rooms to screen and stabilize patients, and so we don't have people dying on the street with no care. But it's also true that our healthcare costs are unsustainable. We're hearing horrible stories about medications that are becoming much more expensive than they ever were. The EpiPen is one recent example. And as a society, we're going to have to address the cost of care. There probably is going to have to be more rationing. Technology has far outstripped our ability to pay for it, and this is one of the biggest challenges that we face as a society, and hopefully our next president will be aware of that.
Dr. Prager.
I think that we have a grossly dysfunctional medical system. At Columbia, we have a big sign that says amazing things are happening here. And in fact, amazing things do happen there, but amazing things also don't happen for a large number of people who need blood pressure medication, diabetes medication, simple things. We have a society which has perverse incentives. Medicine has become a business today. It is no longer a profession. Fee-for-service encourages a huge amount of unnecessary and expensive work. That should be changed. There's so much to say really about it. The electronic medical record has become distorted into a vehicle for trying to game the system so that you write the longest note in order to get the most payment. Not the best note, not the note that will say what's going on. We train our residents to be able to write an electronic medical system note so that we get more money. About a third, I would estimate, and other people have said, about a third of our more than $1 trillion national expenditure for health is wasted and unnecessary. The amount of wasted surgery, the amount of wasted testing, and so forth, we can save a ton of money, but it would require an earthquake to change the system.
Rabbi, last word.
I want to reflect on a bigger issue. The central measure of a just society is how it takes care of the poor and the needy and the desperate. If there's a recurring theme in the Jewish tradition, it's not how the wealthy are taking care of themselves. It's a central measure of society is how it allocates resources to care for the poor. When God evaluates our society as a whole, that's a central measure. This is true in healthcare. This is true in the allocation of all other resources. We're exhorted, particularly in this holiday season, but generally in life, to recognize that how we are looked at is how we help those in greater need than we ourselves are. And in healthcare, this is very important, and in every other aspect of life is very important. That's one of the recurring themes of the Jewish tradition.
Folks, I think we made history tonight, not just because there's a historic debate, but because this is a historic symposium that began exactly on time and ends exactly on time. I want to thank our panelists for doing a phenomenal job. I want to thank the audience. I also just want to mention, in the spirit of the new year, that we wish all of our families and loved ones good health and happiness in the upcoming year. And I want to thank you all very much for joining us tonight. Thank you.